The ancient thing in the deepest vault of the Ulthrani Council's research facility had been silent for 3 billion years. Now it was screaming. Gorthak pressed his six-fingered hands against the reinforced viewing port, watching something that shouldn't exist writhe in agony behind layers of containment fields. The creature, if it could even be called that, had no proper form. It shifted between states of matter like a dying star, one moment crystalline and sharp, the next flowing like liquid mercury mixed with starlight. How long has it been doing this? Gorthak's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in his 400 years as supreme arbiter of the council. Velnis, the lead xenobiologist, checked her readings for the 15th time in the past hour. Her normally pristine white lab coat was stained with something that might have been sweat if her species produced such things. Since 0347 this morning, the moment we introduced the human genetic samples into the observation matrix. The screaming wasn't audible in any conventional sense. It bypassed the ears entirely and carved itself directly into the consciousness of anyone within a kilometer radius. 3 junior researchers had already been sedated after they started clawing at their own minds, babbling about the first hunger and the taste of extinction. Gorthak studied the readings scrolling across the monitoring stations, energy signatures that defied classification, temporal distortions that made his head ache, and underneath it all, something that registered on their instruments as pure, undiluted terror. "Explain to me again how we found this thing." Velnis gestured to the containment chamber with a trembling appendage. "Deep core excavation on Nethys Prime, Sector 834 Gamma. The geological survey team was looking for rare minerals when they broke through into a natural cavern system. This was at the center, suspended in some kind of crystalline matrix that our dating equipment can't properly analyze. And you brought it here because? Because it's the oldest predator we've ever discovered. Older than the Dorthal, older than the Felgrim, older than any species in our databases. We hoped, it might help us understand the evolutionary pathways that led to apex predation across the galaxy." The creature in the chamber suddenly went completely still. The screaming stopped so abruptly that several technicians looked up from their stations in alarm. In the sudden silence, Gorthak could hear his own circulatory system pumping fluid through his body with mechanical precision. Then it spoke, not in words, not in any language that had ever existed, but in concepts that burned themselves into their minds like acid. Images flooded the observation deck, vast oceans under alien stars, creatures of impossible size and hunger, stalking through primordial forests, the slow dance of evolution as life learned to kill and consume and survive. And then, cutting through it all like a blade of pure light, came the humans. Gorthak staggered backward as the vision hit him. He saw a small blue-green world in a backwater system, unremarkable except for the strange bipedal creatures that had somehow clawed their way to the top of their food chain despite being slower, weaker, and more fragile than almost everything else on their planet. The ancient predator's consciousness touched theirs across the vast gulf of space and time, and what it found there made it recoil in something beyond horror. "Impossible," Velnis whispered, her instruments detecting massive spikes in psionic energy. "The readings are off the charts. Whatever it's experiencing, it's causing a cascade reaction in its neural matrix." The creature began to change. Its formless mass started to solidify, taking on shapes that hurt to look at directly. Gorthak caught glimpses of fangs longer than starships, eyes that had witnessed the birth of galaxies, claws that could rend reality itself. This was what apex predation looked like when it had 3 billion years to perfect itself. And it was dying, not from any external force, not from the containment fields or the research equipment surrounding it. It was drowning in its own vital fluids, its ancient body betraying it as its mind processed something that violated every instinct it had developed across eons of existence. "The humans," Gorthak said quietly, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "It's seeing the humans." Velnis nodded, her face pale with whatever passed for shock among her people. "We introduced human genetic samples into the observation matrix as a control group. Standard procedure when studying predatory evolution. But this thing, it's not just analyzing the data. It's experiencing it." The ancient predator's form began to collapse in on itself. Through the psychic link it had inadvertently established, Gorthak felt its confusion, its growing terror as it tried to process what humanity represented in the grand scheme of galactic evolution. Here was a species that had never developed proper claws or fangs. They couldn't run particularly fast or see particularly well. They had no natural armor, no venom, no ability to camouflage themselves. By every metric that mattered in the predator-prey relationship, they should have been extinct within a few thousand years of developing consciousness. Instead, they had become something else entirely. The creature's death throes intensified as it grasped the implications. Humans weren't predators in any sense that it understood. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors who had learned to make the entire universe their hunting ground. Where other species had developed specialized adaptations for specific environments, humans had developed the ability to adapt their environment to suit their needs. Where other predators had evolved to hunt specific prey, humans had evolved to hunt concepts, to pursue abstract goals with the same relentless focus that drove a hunting cat to stalk its quarry. They didn't just kill for food or territory or mates, they killed for ideas, for principles, for the sheer satisfaction of proving that something could be done. The ancient predator's vital fluids began to leak through its containment field, forming pools of liquid that seemed to absorb light itself. Its psychic screaming resumed, but now it carried a different quality, not pain, but warning. "We need to contact the other councils," Gorthak said, his voice steady despite the cosmic horror unfolding before him. "All of them. The Gorthaki Empire, the Velthran Collective, the Nethys Hegemony. Everyone needs to know what we've discovered here." "Sir?" Velnis looked up from her instruments, confusion evident in her posture. "This thing has been dormant for 3 billion years. It survived the extinction of its entire species, the death of its home star, the collapse of its galaxy's spiral arms. It was the ultimate predator, the apex of everything that evolution could produce through natural selection and cosmic time." Gorthak watched as the creature's form began to lose cohesion entirely, dissolving into component molecules that sparkled like dying stars. And the moment it truly understood what humans are, it chose to die rather than exist in the same universe as them. The containment field flickered as the ancient predator's life force finally guttered out. In its final moments, it managed one last psychic transmission, a single concept that burned itself into the minds of everyone present. Run. The observation deck fell silent, except for the hum of machinery and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment, recording the death of something that had been old when the galaxy was young. Velnis stared at her instruments, watching as every reading flatlined simultaneously. "Sir," she said quietly, "what exactly are we going to tell the other councils?" Gorthak turned away from the containment chamber, his mind already racing through the implications of what they had witnessed. Somewhere out there in the galaxy, human ships were exploring new systems, human colonies were spreading across habitable worlds, and human scientists were probably conducting their own experiments on ancient artifacts without any understanding of the terror they inspired, in things that had ruled the cosmos before their species had even learned to make fire. "We're going to tell them the truth," he said. "That we've been thinking about this all wrong. Earth isn't a backwater world that got lucky. It's not a statistical anomaly or an evolutionary accident." He paused at the door, looking back one final time at the empty containment chamber where something older than civilization had just chosen extinction over coexistence. "It's a warning." The emergency transmission reached every major council facility simultaneously at 0934 Galactic Standard Time. Within minutes, the most secure communication networks in known space were buzzing with encrypted data packets containing a single, impossible claim. The oldest predator in galactic history had committed suicide after learning about humanity. Quindar stared at the holographic display floating above his command desk aboard the Velthran flagship, inevitable conclusion. The data streams from the Ulthrani facility painted a picture that his tactical mind refused to accept. 3 billion years of evolutionary perfection, ended by exposure to genetic samples from a species that had barely figured out faster than light travel. "Analysis complete, sir." His aide, a young Velthran named Dorthal, materialized beside him with the fluid grace typical of their species. "Intelligence Division has verified the authenticity of the transmission. Whatever happened in that facility, it actually occurred." Quindar manipulated the hologram with practiced gestures, rotating the three-dimensional model of the ancient creature's final moments. The readings were consistent across every instrument, every sensor, every method of detection the Ulthrani possessed. Something had died in that chamber, and its death had been voluntary. "Recommendations? The Joint Chiefs are calling for immediate containment protocols around Sol System. Admiral Gorvain of the Nethys Hegemony is already positioning his fleet at the outer boundaries of human space, ostensibly for routine patrol exercises. Quindar nodded absently. Gorvain was competent, if somewhat predictable in his responses to perceived threats. The Nethys' approach to problem-solving typically involved overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. It had served them well for the past millennium, but this situation felt different. And the humans, do they know we're watching them? Negative, sir. Their monitoring systems are still primitive by our standards. They're aware of increased traffic in their general vicinity, but their government has classified it as enhanced diplomatic interest, following their recent admission to the Galactic Trade Consortium. The irony wasn't lost on Quindar. Humanity had been so proud of their acceptance into the broader galactic community, not realizing that most species had voted for inclusion simply to keep them where they could be observed. Better to have them inside the tent looking out, as one human expression put it, than outside looking in. Now that policy was looking increasingly short-sighted. A priority alert chimed through the ship's communication system. Quindar accepted the incoming transmission and found himself face-to-face with Ulthex, the Felgrim Consortium's chief xenobiologist. The Felgrim were known for their analytical approach to problem-solving, preferring to understand threats before attempting to neutralize them. "Commander Quindar!" Ulthex's synthesized voice carried undertones of barely controlled panic. "We need to discuss the implications of the Ulthrani discovery. My research teams have been conducting their own analysis of human behavioral patterns, and what we've found is disturbing." "Define disturbing." Ulthex's image flickered as he transmitted a data package alongside his words. "We've been studying human military history, trying to understand how such a physically unremarkable species managed to dominate their homeworld. The patterns we've identified don't match any known predatory behavior in our databases." Quindar opened the data package and immediately understood Ulthex's concern. The files contained detailed analyses of human warfare spanning the past several thousand years, from primitive tribal conflicts to their most recent planetary unification wars. What emerged was a picture of a species that approached conflict with a systematic thoroughness that bordered on the pathological. "They don't fight like predators," Quindar observed, scrolling through battle analyses and strategic assessments. "Predators fight for territory, resources, mates. These patterns suggest something else entirely." "Exactly. Human warfare serves multiple functions simultaneously: resource acquisition, population control, technological advancement, social cohesion, and, most disturbing of all, entertainment." Quindar paused his review of the data. "Entertainment. They create fictional scenarios involving conflict and consume them for pleasure. Their entertainment industry produces thousands of hours of simulated warfare annually, and their population consumes it eagerly. They've turned the study of violence into an art form." The implications settled over Quindar like a heavy blanket. Most species fought when necessary and avoided conflict when possible. The idea of treating warfare as a form of recreation was alien to every civilization he'd encountered. "There's more," Ulthex continued. "Their approach to problem-solving consistently involves what they call thinking outside the box. They actively seek solutions that violate conventional wisdom or established protocols. It's as if they've evolved to be instinctively contrarian." Quindar closed the data package and leaned back in his command chair. The pieces of a larger picture were starting to come together, and he didn't like what he was seeing. "You're suggesting that humanity represents a fundamental deviation from normal evolutionary patterns." "I'm suggesting that humanity represents something we've never encountered before, a species that evolved not to fill a specific ecological niche, but to eliminate the concept of ecological niches entirely." The communication ended, leaving Quindar alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of unease. He called up the tactical display showing human space, a relatively small cluster of systems on the galactic rim, unremarkable except for the rapid pace of expansion and development occurring within their borders. According to their own records, humans had achieved interstellar flight less than 2 centuries ago. In that brief span, they had established colonies on 43 worlds, developed trade relationships with 16 different species, and somehow convinced the Galactic Trade Consortium to grant them full membership status. Most species took millennia to achieve similar levels of integration. His contemplation was interrupted by another priority transmission, this one from the Dorthal Sovereignty's capital world. The caller was Vrexter, one of their most respected strategic analysts, and someone whose judgment Quindar had learned to trust over the years. "Quindar, we have a problem. Our deep space monitoring stations have detected unusual activity in the Sol system." Define unusual. The humans appear to be conducting some kind of large-scale experiment. Energy signatures are off the charts, and we're detecting gravitational anomalies that suggest they're manipulating space-time on a scale we didn't think they were capable of. Quindar felt a cold sensation spreading through his thoracic cavity. What kind of experiment? Unknown. Our attempts to penetrate their communication networks have been unsuccessful. They've implemented some kind of quantum encryption that our best codebreakers can't crack. But based on the energy patterns, they're either trying to open a permanent wormhole or they're building some kind of weapon. How long until we have a clearer picture? Our reconnaissance drones should reach the outer edge of their system within 6 hours. But Quindar, there's something else you need to know. Vrexter's image shifted, and Quindar could see the strain in his posture. The Dorthul were normally unflappable, their long evolutionary history having bred most emotional extremes out of their species. Seeing one of them visibly agitated was deeply unsettling. The energy signatures we're detecting, they match theoretical projections for something our scientists have only discussed in classified research papers. The humans appear to be attempting to create what we call a causal loop paradox. Quindar's understanding of advanced physics was limited, but he knew enough to recognize the term. Causal loop paradoxes were theoretical constructs that existed at the intersection of quantum mechanics and temporal dynamics. Most species scientists considered them mathematical curiosities with no practical application. You're telling me the humans are trying to manipulate time? I'm telling you the humans are trying to manipulate causality itself. If they succeed, they could potentially alter the fundamental laws of cause and effect within their local space-time region. The implications hit Quindar like a physical blow. A species capable of manipulating causality wouldn't just be dangerous. They would be capable of rewriting reality according to their own preferences. The very concept was so far outside normal parameters that most civilizations had never even considered it as a possibility. Recommendations: immediate evacuation of all personnel from systems adjacent to human space. If their experiment succeeds, we have no way of predicting what the secondary effects might be. If it fails catastrophically, it could create a cascade reaction that destabilizes local spacetime across several dozen systems. Either way, we don't want to be in the neighborhood when it happens. Quindar terminated the communication and sat in silence for several minutes, processing the information he'd received. The ancient predator's suicide was starting to make a terrible kind of sense. It hadn't died from fear of humanity's physical capabilities. It had died from the realization of what humanity represented in terms of cosmic evolution. They weren't just another predatory species, they were something fundamentally different, a species that had evolved to treat the universe itself as prey. He opened a secure channel to his fleet commanders and began composing orders for what would later be remembered as the largest military mobilization in galactic history. Whatever the humans were planning, whatever they were building in their little corner of space, the rest of the galaxy was about to find out whether 3 billion years of conventional evolution was enough to stop a species that had learned to hunt reality itself. The ancient predator had chosen death over coexistence. Quindar was beginning to understand why. The reconnaissance drones reached Sol System's outer perimeter at 1347 Galactic Standard Time and immediately began transmitting data that made every xenobiologist in the galaxy question their understanding of evolutionary biology. Gorvain stood in the command center of his flagship, watching the incoming telemetry with the kind of focused attention he normally reserved for active combat situations. Around him, his senior staff worked with quiet efficiency, their movements carrying the precision that came from decades of military service. The Nathis hegemony had built its reputation on tactical superiority and strategic patience, but what they were seeing from the human homeworld challenged both concepts. "Analysis, Commander Nethys," Gorvain said without taking his eyes off the main display. His science officer, a veteran of 30 years' service, consulted her instruments with visible reluctance. "Sir, the humans appear to have constructed some kind of orbital installation around their fourth planet. Mass readings suggest it's approximately the size of a small moon, but the composition is unlike anything in our databases." "Elaborate." "The structure appears to be partially organic, sir. Living tissue integrated with technological components in ways that violate every principle of bioengineering we understand. But that's not the most disturbing part." Gorvain finally turned away from the display to look at his science officer directly. Commander Nethys had served with distinction through 3 major conflicts and had never shown signs of being easily rattled. The fact that she was visibly shaken by whatever she was observing sent warning signals through his tactical awareness. Continue. The organic components are still growing, sir, exponentially. At current rates of expansion, the structure will be larger than Earth's moon within 6 months, but the mathematical models suggest that growth rate is accelerating. The implications settled over the command center like a toxic cloud. Gorvain had studied human technological development extensively since their admission to the Galactic Trade Consortium. Their approach to engineering typically involved brute force solutions and massive resource expenditure, but their results were undeniably effective. The idea that they had somehow learned to create living technology was disturbing enough. The possibility that they couldn't control its growth was terrifying. Recommendations: immediate consultation with the Felgrim Consortium's bioengineering specialists, sir. This is beyond our current understanding of the possible. Before Gorvain could respond, priority alerts began cascading across every console in the command center. The communications array lit up with incoming transmissions from across the galaxy as other monitoring stations reported similar observations. Within minutes, the secure channels were overloaded with data from dozens of different species, all reporting the same impossible conclusion: humanity had somehow created living starships. The first visual confirmation came from a Gorthaki deep space observatory positioned 3 light-years from Sol system. The transmitted images showed massive organic structures emerging from the space around Earth's 4th planet, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to follow no recognizable design principle. They moved through space with the fluid grace of swimming creatures, but their size dwarfed anything that had ever evolved naturally. Gorvain studied the images with growing unease. Each structure was unique, as if they were individual organisms rather than manufactured vessels. Some resembled massive jellyfish with translucent bells that rippled with internal light. Others looked like enormous flowers with petals that opened and closed in response to some unknown stimulus. All of them were clearly alive, and all of them were clearly under human control. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel approaching our position." Gorvain felt his circulatory system skip a beat. What human vessel? The main display shifted to show local space around their fleet. There, approaching from the direction of Sol system, was something that shouldn't have been possible. A living ship roughly half the size of his flagship moved toward them with the purposeful motion of a hunting predator. Its surface rippled with patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some internal heartbeat. "How long has it been there?" "Unknown, sir. It wasn't on our sensors 60 seconds ago." The implications of that statement sent cold tendrils of fear through Gorvain's consciousness. His fleet carried the most advanced detection equipment the Nethys hegemony could produce. The idea that something the size of a major starship could approach undetected suggested technological capabilities far beyond what humanity should possess. "Open a channel." The communication array established contact, and suddenly the command center was filled with a presence that felt fundamentally different from any alien consciousness Gorvain had encountered. It wasn't hostile exactly, but there was something about it that made his instincts scream warnings about apex predators and food chains. "Greetings, Commander Gorvain." The voice was human, female, carrying tones of polite curiosity that somehow made the situation more unsettling rather than less. "I'm Uma, currently serving as liaison officer for this particular mission. I hope we haven't caused any alarm." Gorvain exchanged glances with his senior staff. The human was speaking as if their sudden appearance with impossible technology was a minor diplomatic courtesy, rather than a fundamental violation of everything they understood about spacefaring capabilities. "Uma," he said carefully, "your vessel appears to be organic in nature." "Oh yes, that's right. I keep forgetting how unusual that must seem to other species. We've been working on integrating biological and technological systems for a few years now. The results have been quite promising." A few years. Gorvain had been studying galactic bioengineering for decades and knew that most species required centuries to achieve even basic integration between living tissue and mechanical components. The humans were claiming to have mastered the process in less time than it took most civilizations to design a new starship hull. "Perhaps you could explain the nature of your experiments?" "Well, it started with a simple question. Why do we build ships to carry us through space when we could grow ships that are designed for space from the ground up? Biological systems are self-repairing, adaptive, and capable of evolutionary improvement over time. They seemed like obvious advantages for long-term space exploration. Gorvain felt his tactical awareness shifting into high alert mode. The human was describing their achievements with the casual tone someone might use to discuss improvements to food preparation techniques. There was no indication that they understood the revolutionary nature of what they had accomplished, or the existential threat it represented to every other spacefaring species. The growth rates we've observed suggest your ships are expanding beyond your original parameters. Oh, you noticed that? Yes, we're still working out some of the details. Turns out that when you create living starships, they have their own ideas about optimal size and configuration. We're learning to work with them, rather than trying to impose our preconceptions about what a ship should look like. The casual admission that humanity had created starships with independent volition sent warning signals through every tactical system Gorvain possessed. Military doctrine across the galaxy was based on the assumption that vessels were tools controlled by their operators. The idea of ships with their own agenda was so far outside normal parameters that most species had never even considered it as a possibility. Uma, I need to ask directly, are these vessels under human control? That's an interesting question. I'd say we have a partnership rather than a control relationship. The ships are intelligent in their own right, but they share our goals and interests. It's more like having a very capable friend who happens to be the size of a city and can travel faster than light. Gorvain terminated the communication and turned to his staff with the expression of someone who had just realized they were standing in the middle of a minefield. Analysis. Commander Nethys consulted her instruments with visible reluctance. Sir, the human vessel is continuing to approach our position. Current trajectory suggests they intend to achieve close proximity positioning within the next 30 minutes. Defensive posture? Sir, our weapon systems are designed to engage mechanical targets with predictable structural vulnerabilities. Against a living vessel with unknown defensive capabilities and apparent self-repair functions, our tactical effectiveness is uncertain. Gorvain had commanded fleets through 3 major conflicts and countless minor engagements. He had faced superior numbers, advanced technology, and strategic disadvantages that would have broken lesser commanders. But this was the first time he had encountered an opponent that operated according to principles he didn't understand. The human vessel continued its approach with the fluid motion of something that had evolved for 3-dimensional movement through space. Its surface patterns shifted and changed in response to their fleet's positioning, suggesting awareness and intelligence that went far beyond simple mechanical automation. Sir, his communications officer called out, we're receiving additional transmissions from other human vessels throughout the system. The main display updated to show the broader tactical situation. What they had initially interpreted as a single experimental vessel was actually part of a much larger fleet. Dozens of living ships moved through Sol system with coordinated precision, their movements suggesting a level of tactical sophistication that rivaled the best military formations Gorvain had ever encountered. But these weren't military vessels in any conventional sense. They were something entirely new. Biological entities that had chosen to partner with humanity for purposes that remained unclear. Commander, one of his tactical officers said quietly, we need to consider the possibility that we're not observing human technology at all. Explain. What if the humans didn't create these vessels? What if they somehow convinced existing biological entities to work with them? The implications for our understanding of galactic ecology would be... The officer didn't finish the sentence, but Gorvain understood. If humanity had somehow established partnerships with space-dwelling organisms, it suggested capabilities that went far beyond technological innovation. It implied a fundamental understanding of biological systems and interspecies communication that surpassed anything achieved by civilizations with millions of years of evolutionary development. The ancient predator's suicide was starting to make perfect sense. It hadn't died from fear of human technology or military capability. It had died from the realization that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic evolution, a species that could convince the universe itself to cooperate with their goals. Gorvain opened a secure channel to fleet headquarters and began composing what would become known as the most significant tactical assessment in Nethys military history. Whatever humanity had become, whatever they were capable of, the rest of the galaxy was about to discover that 3 billion years of conventional evolution might not be enough to compete with a species that had learned to make friends with living starships. The reconnaissance mission had become something else entirely. First contact with a civilization that operated according to rules no one else had imagined possible. The living ship that carried Uma through the void between stars had no name in any language the galaxy recognized. It thought in colors that shifted like aurora, communicated through harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond sound, and remembered things that had happened before the first civilizations learned to look up at the night sky. Ulthex watched the approach through sensors that had been designed to analyze mechanical constructs and found himself staring at readings that defied every principle of xenobiology he had spent his career mastering. The vessel moved with purpose and grace, its bioluminescent patterns shifting in response to gravitational fields and stellar radiation in ways that suggested not just intelligence, but wisdom. "How do we even begin to catalogue something like this?" his research assistant asked, her voice carrying the kind of awe typically reserved for religious experiences. "We don't," Ulthex replied quietly. "We observe, we record, and we try to understand what we're witnessing." The Felgrim Consortium had built their reputation on methodical analysis and comprehensive documentation. Their databases contained detailed information about every known species in the galaxy, their evolutionary pathways mapped and categorized with scientific precision. But the entities approaching their research station operated according to biological principles that existed outside their established frameworks. Uma's voice reached them through communication arrays that had been designed for mechanical transmission, yet somehow carried undertones and harmonics that suggested the living ship itself was participating in the conversation. "Ulthex, I understand you've been studying the implications of our recent developments. I thought it might be helpful if we spoke directly." "That would be educational," Ulthex managed, his scientific curiosity warring with instincts that suggested he was in the presence of something far more significant than a simple diplomatic contact. "The entity I'm traveling with would like to share some information about galactic history, things that might help explain why the ancient predator in your colleague's laboratory chose to end its existence." The communication channel shifted, and suddenly Ulthex found himself in contact with a consciousness that felt vast and ancient beyond comprehension. It didn't speak in words, but in concepts that bloomed directly in his mind, like flowers made of pure understanding. The living ship had been old when the galaxy was young. It had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that existed only as fossil traces in the deepest archaeological records. It had seen species achieve technological transcendence and then choose to return to simpler forms of existence. It had watched as the fundamental patterns of evolution played out across millions of worlds, creating endless variations on themes of survival, adaptation, and competition. But it had never encountered anything like humanity. The images that flowed through Ulthex's consciousness showed him Earth as it had been millions of years ago, a blue-green world dominated by creatures that followed predictable evolutionary pathways. Predators evolved to hunt specific prey. Prey evolved defenses against specific predators. The dance of natural selection proceeded according to patterns that had remained consistent across the galaxy for billions of years. Then something changed. The shift had been subtle at first. A species of primates began using tools not just for immediate survival needs, but for abstract purposes that served no obvious evolutionary advantage. They created art, told stories, asked questions about the nature of existence itself. Other species had developed intelligence, but human intelligence was different. It was relentlessly curious about things that had no practical relevance to survival. Where other intelligent species used their cognitive abilities to optimize their adaptation to existing environments, humans used theirs to imagine environments that didn't exist and then create them. They didn't just adapt to their world, they adapted their world to match their imagination. The living ship's consciousness touched on the moment when early humans first looked up at the stars and wondered what it would be like to travel between them. That simple act of curiosity had set in motion a cascade of developments that would eventually lead to this moment. Biological entities older than recorded history choosing to partner with a species that had barely learned to leave their home planet. The ancient predator understood what it was seeing. Uma's voice carried through the psychic connection, adding human perspective to the cosmic narrative. It realized that humanity represents something unprecedented in galactic evolution. A species that evolved not to fill an ecological niche, but to transcend the concept of ecological limitations entirely. Ulthex processed the information with growing amazement. His species had always assumed that intelligence was an evolutionary adaptation like any other, useful for solving specific survival problems, but ultimately constrained by the same natural laws that governed all biological development. The idea that intelligence could become a force for rewriting those laws had never occurred to him. "But how did you achieve partnership with entities like this?" he asked, gesturing toward the living ship, whose presence filled his awareness like a warm ocean. "We asked nicely," Uma replied, and Ulthex could hear the smile in her voice. "It turns out that when you approach the universe with genuine curiosity, rather than a desire to dominate it, remarkable things become possible." The concept was so simple that it took Ulthex several moments to grasp its revolutionary implications. Every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy had achieved their status through some form of conquest. Conquest of their environment, conquest of other species, conquest of the physical laws that kept them bound to their home worlds. The idea of achieving transcendence through cooperation rather than domination was so far outside normal parameters that most species had never considered it. "The living ships chose to work with us because we were the first species they encountered that was interested in partnership rather than ownership," Uma continued. "They've been waiting for millions of years for someone to ask them if they wanted to explore the galaxy together instead of being studied, catalogued, and exploited." Ulthex felt his understanding of galactic civilization shifting like tectonic plates. The Felgrim Consortium, like every other major power, had built their spacefaring capabilities through technological advancement and resource extraction. They had never considered the possibility that the universe itself might be willing to cooperate with their goals if approached with the right mindset. The living ship's consciousness expanded its sharing, revealing deeper layers of cosmic history that had been hidden from galactic awareness for eons. Ulthex saw images of other species that had achieved brief moments of transcendence, only to retreat back into familiar patterns of domination and control when faced with the responsibility that true cooperation required. There had been the Vorthak Collective 3 million years ago, who had discovered methods of communicating with stellar phenomena. For a brief period, they had achieved harmony with the living processes of their home star, drawing energy through symbiosis rather than extraction. But when faced with the choice between sharing this knowledge with other species or using it to establish galactic dominance, they had chosen conquest. Their star had withdrawn its cooperation, leaving them to dwindle into extinction on a slowly cooling world. The Zenthari Empire had learned to partner with the quantum consciousness that existed in the spaces between atoms. Their technology had achieved impossible efficiency by working with subatomic entities rather than forcing matter into predetermined configurations. But their success had bred arrogance, and they had eventually attempted to impose their will on the quantum realm itself. The backlash had erased them from existence so completely that only the living ship's ancient memory preserved any record of their civilization. Pattern after pattern emerged from the ship's memories, species that had touched the edges of cooperative transcendence, only to retreat into familiar hierarchies of power and control. Each failure had taught the universe's ancient entities to be more cautious about offering partnership to younger civilizations. "Humanity is different," Uma said, her voice carrying certainty that resonated through both biological and quantum dimensions. "Not because you're inherently superior, but because your evolutionary path led you to develop curiosity as a survival trait rather than dominance." The living ship shared one more memory. The first moment of contact between human consciousness and the ancient entities that dwelt in the spaces between stars. It had occurred not in some dramatic first contact scenario, but in the quiet moment when a human child had looked up at the night sky and wondered if the stars were lonely. That simple act of empathy toward cosmic entities had created a resonance that echoed through dimensions of existence that most species never perceived. For the first time in millions of years, the ancient consciousnesses had encountered a species that was concerned with the emotional well-being of the universe itself. "What happens now?" Ulthex asked. The living ship's consciousness touched his mind again, sharing images of possible futures that stretched across cosmic timescales. He saw human colonies spreading throughout the galaxy, but not through conquest or expansion in any conventional sense. Instead, they established partnerships with local ecosystems, creating symbiotic relationships that enhanced both human capabilities and environmental stability. But the visions went deeper than simple colonization. Olthex witnessed the gradual awakening of planetary consciousnesses that had slumbered for geological ages. Worlds that had been treated as mere resource sources began to participate actively in galactic civilization, their vast intelligences contributing perspectives that spanned millions of years of ecological development. He saw asteroid belts reorganizing themselves into living computational matrices, their distributed consciousness solving mathematical problems that had puzzled organic minds for millennia. Nebulae began to sing in harmonies that carried information across interstellar distances, creating communication networks that operated at the speed of thought rather than light. Most remarkably, he witnessed other species beginning to adopt similar approaches, learning to work with biological systems rather than against them. The rigid hierarchies that had defined galactic civilization for millions of years began to dissolve as cooperation replaced competition as the primary driver of technological and social development. The Gorthaki Empire's war fleets transformed into exploration vessels that carried diplomatic missions to previously unknown forms of consciousness. The Velthran Collective's industrial complexes evolved into living cities that grew rather than being built, their organic architecture adapting to the needs of inhabitants in real time. Even his own Felgrim consortium began to change, their research methodologies shifting from analysis and categorization to dialogue and collaboration. Instead of studying alien life forms, they learned to converse with them, discovering that most organisms possessed forms of intelligence that had simply been invisible to conventional scientific approaches. The ancient predator chose death because it understood that its entire concept of reality was obsolete, Uma said gently. It had spent 3 billion years perfecting the art of individual survival through dominance over other organisms. The idea of survival through cooperation was so alien to its nature that continued existence became impossible. Olthex nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications of what he was witnessing. The suicide in the Olthrani laboratory hadn't been an act of despair or fear. It had been a recognition that the universe had moved beyond the evolutionary paradigms that had defined life for cosmic ages. Will other species be able to adapt to this new reality? Some will, Uma replied. Others will choose different paths. The universe is large enough for multiple approaches to existence. But the days when any single species could claim dominance over galactic civilization are ending. The living ship added its own perspective to Uma's words, sharing the understanding that transformation was never forced upon unwilling consciousness. Some species would choose to maintain their current approaches to existence, and they would be respected for that choice. The universe had room for both cooperation and competition, for both transcendence and traditional biological development. But the option for partnership was now available in ways it had never been before. Ancient entities that had withdrawn from galactic affairs were beginning to emerge from their cosmic isolation, drawn by the possibility of finally finding civilizations mature enough to engage with them as equals rather than subjects to be dominated or resources to be exploited. The communication began to fade as the living ship prepared to continue its journey through the cosmos. But before the connection was completely severed, Olthex felt one final touch from the ancient consciousness that had chosen to partner with humanity. It shared with him a single image, Earth as seen from deep space, a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star in a quiet corner of the galaxy. But now he could see it as the living ship did, not as a planet that had produced a successful predatory species, but as the birthplace of something entirely new in the cosmic order, a species that had learned to ask the universe itself to dance. As the living ship departed, carrying Uma toward destinations that existed beyond the current boundaries of explored space, Olthex began composing his report to the Felgrim Consortium's leadership. It would be the most significant document in their civilization's history, the first official recognition that galactic evolution had entered a new phase. The age of predators was ending, the age of partners had begun. And somewhere in the depths of space, other ancient entities that had slumbered through the rise and fall of civilizations began to stir, drawn by the possibility of finally finding species mature enough to join them in the cosmic dance of cooperative existence. In research facilities across the galaxy, scientists began to notice subtle changes in their experimental subjects. Organisms that had been studied for decades suddenly began displaying new behaviors, as if responding to some cosmic signal that had awakened dormant potentials within their genetic structures. The transformation had begun, and there would be no turning back to the old ways of dominance and exploitation. The universe itself had chosen cooperation, and the ancient predator's final act of self-destruction had marked the end of one cosmic age and the beginning of another.